Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So, lots to talk about this week. We are going to have our lecture on Hans Eysenck, so we'll talk about his theories this week. This will also be considered a trait theory, so it'll have some things in common with what we talked about last week when we talked about McCrae and Costa, but there will also be some things that are unique to Eysenck as well. After today's lecture, you will have all of the material that you need for exam 3. So after watching this lecture, I recommend that you also watch the review video that I'm going to be posting. It'll just have a brief review of the study guide there. Let me know if you have any questions as you start to study. Now remember that exam 3 is going to be available starting on Monday, April 3rd at noon, so 12 p.m. And then it will close the next Monday at noon as well, so you'll have a week to take it. There will also be that practice exam for extra credit that you can take during that time. Okay? So let me know if you have any questions. You also will have an activity this week that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m., so don't forget about that. I think that's it, so let's go ahead and jump into lecture for today. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be talking about the theories of Hans Eysenck. Now, I must admit that Eysenck is one of my favorite theorists that we're going to be talking about this semester. To me, his theory just seems so logical, and it's well supported by a lot of research, and I really like it. And so we'll get into exactly what it was that he talked about in a second. First, I want to kind of review what we talked about last time. We were talking about the theories of McCrae and Costa. We said that McCrae and Costa were the first theorists that we had specifically talked about this semester who would be considered trait theorists. And when we're talking about trait theories, we're talking about the idea that there are a certain number, and we could debate how many, but a certain number of universal personality traits. And so everyone's individual personality is made up of a combination of being high or low on these various personality traits. So assuming that this is correct, as trait theorists would suggest, they're going to have to then decide how many personality traits exist. So we talked about the fact that Raymond Cattell, although we have not had a lecture specifically dedicated to him, suggested that there was a large number of factors. Last week we said that McCrae and Costa thought there were 5, and they decided that 5 was a good number. Today we're going to be talking about Eysenck, and he's going to suggest that there are only 3. So we'll talk a little bit later about why Eysenck suggested there were only 3, and why his theory is a little bit more specific, a little more narrow here. But all of these theorists used factor analysis to help them decide what traits should be considered and included in their theory. So when we're talking about Eysenck, he was born in Berlin, Germany, and then ended up leaving Germany, going to England during the period of the Nazis in Germany to escape from that. And when he came to England, he was wanting to study science, wanting to be a scientist, but he wasn't sure what area of science that he might want to research. Right? He was initially interested in physics, but found out he didn't have all of the background that he needed to be able to do physics. Ended up doing psychology at a university that was very much so focused on psychometrics, so talking specifically about statistics and research-oriented, and so you're going to see that theme throughout his theory. He wrote many different books and articles, and he and his wife actually wrote together. You can imagine that that could be both a great experience as well as maybe a challenge, working directly with your spouse. He is very well known. He is cited quite a bit. Some individuals would consider him controversial, but I particularly like his theory, which we'll get into in a second. So just as a review, as we talked about last time about factor analysis, we said that it's a statistical method. And basically what it's doing is it's looking for underlying relationships between different factors. So what we talked about last week is that we could have several different measures that are all measuring different personality traits. We could see which traits that they found that are correlated with each other, and we say, okay, it seems like these things always go together. Maybe they're both part of some underlying bigger trait here. And so we said last time that McCrae and Costa found 5 traits that they believed that all of these other personality characteristics were basically part of one of those 5 traits. And so the strength of that correlation, or the strength of the factor loading here, tells us how strongly they're related to each other. We talked about how you can have unipolar traits, which basically just measure an amount from small to large, or we could have a bipolar trait where someone on one end of the spectrum has a totally different personality characteristic from someone on the other end of the spectrum. So when we talked about McCrae and Costa, we said that their 5 traits are going to be bipolar traits, Eysenck's traits will also be bipolar traits. All right, here we go. Eysenck did like factor analysis. He was a trait theorist. He liked the fact that it was driven by statistics. However, Eysenck was also critical of trait theory a little bit when it comes to factor analysis, because he suggested that it should be all about the statistics when you're using factor analysis, but there is some room for interpretation with factor analysis. And so he suggested that maybe we were being a little bit too subjective in our choices of what should be a trait. So he came up with some very specific criteria, and if a factor, potential factor, didn't meet his criteria, it wasn't included in his theory. So you can see if he has very strict criteria, that may be why he only found 3 factors. So he suggested, first of all, there has to be psychometric evidence. In other words, it has to make sense based on the research and the statistics. Heritability is going to be a very big component of Eysenck's theory. When we're talking about heritability, basically we're talking about genetics. So he believed and found a pretty good bit of research to support that personality characteristics are largely genetic, so a trait had to make sense when viewed from that viewpoint, as well as from a theoretical viewpoint, so making sense based on the data that we already have. It should also help us to predict future behavior. It should make sense based on theory. And then it must possess social relevance. It has to explain behavior. It has to somehow provide a guide practically to psychologists, to researchers. So we have to have all of these 4 criteria basically met for Eysenck to say that something is a personality trait. So when he's talking about his traits, we're going to see here that there's this hierarchy of behavior organization. So follow with me here. When we're talking about an individual, we're looking at their personality, we could talk about their specific acts or cognitions. What we mean by that is what you're doing right now, this particular behavior that you're doing or a particular thing that you're thinking right now. And of course, we could debate whether your behaviors and your thoughts go in the same category as a thought of behavior, all of that. We will have that debate actually later when we talk about Skinner, but we'll get there in time. So you have your specific behaviors or thoughts, what you're doing right now. Now, typically, your specific behaviors are related to your habitual behaviors, right? So by this point in life, you probably have some habits, you have some behaviors that you follow with most of the time. So there's probably going to be a relationship between what you're doing right now and what you usually do. There's also probably going to be a relationship between what you usually do or what you usually think with your traits. Now, when we're talking about traits here, we're thinking about something maybe similar to the concept of a central trait that we talked about earlier when we talked about Allport, about how there are some personality traits that generally explain who you are. If another person was going to describe you, this might be what they would say. Okay, so what you're doing right now is probably related to what you usually do. What you usually do is probably related to those personality characteristics that you have. And then Eysenck would say that your personality characteristics are related to what he called types or super factors. The types or super factors here are basically going to be his big 3. So last week we talked about the big 5. We said there were 5 traits. He's going to have 3 traits that he would also call types or super factors that we're going to talk about in a second. Now, it is certainly possible that you might have a specific behavior or thought that doesn't line up with what you usually do, right? But for the most part, there's going to be a relationship between what you do sometimes, what you do all the time, your personality traits, and then your overall personality structure based on these 3 characteristics or 3 factors or 3 types that Eysenck theorized about. Okay, so then let's get into what these 3 general super factors or traits are. So according to Eysenck, we have 3 factors as opposed to 5 that we talked about last week. He suggested that these factors are extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Okay, now extroversion and neuroticism were both mentioned last week when we talked about the big 5, but psychoticism is a new one that we're going to talk about in a second. But kind of building on what we talked about last time, thinking back to last lecture, when we talk about an individual being extroverted, what we're really saying is that this is a person who is very outgoing, sociable, active. They don't like to sit still, like to always be doing something, usually pretty relaxed, fairly carefree in their personality, oftentimes open to experience, which we had openness to experience as a different personality factor in last lecture, but you could see that that could be related to extroversion as well, right? Someone who is sensation seeking, that kind of thing. Now, remember that Eysenck's theory of personality, and you'll see more of this as we go through this lecture, is very much based on your genetics or your heritability, right? So what Eysenck suggested is that an individual who is high on extroversion, so this person who is very social, they're very lively, they like to be around other people most, these individuals, according to Eysenck, behave that way because of their natural arousal level, right? Okay, follow with me here. So your brain's natural activity level is something that is very biological in nature and is very genetic in nature, very heritable, likely to have been inherited from your parents. So, and then we're going to talk about the research later to support this, but Eysenck would suggest that individuals who are extroverted have a naturally low, what he called cortical arousal level. Basically what we're saying is that their normal arousal level is very low. So what that means is they're more likely to get bored. They don't have quite as much going on. So then they go out and they seek excitement. They feel like they need sensation, right? Because these individuals are a little bit more likely, based on their genetic predisposition, to be bored more easily, that kind of thing. So then they're more likely to go out and do things. On the other hand, someone who is introverted, and there's some research to suggest this, they tend to have naturally high cortical arousal levels. So in other words, they don't usually seek stimulation. In fact, someone who is an introvert might try to avoid excitement or avoid stimulation because they already have enough arousal going on neurologically that anything in addition to that is overwhelming or distracting for them, right? So what we're going to see, there's going to be research on this later then, that individuals who are extroverted typically do their best as far as performance goes when they have a high level of stimulation, which might explain why some people do better when they're studying in groups or when they're studying and there's music playing, or maybe it's easy for them to carry on a conversation or study or read a book even if they're surrounded by people and noises. Whereas on the other hand, some individuals, especially those who tend to be more introverted, they don't do very well when they're trying to focus or pay attention. They tend to perform best when there's low stimulation. So if there's a lot of people around or there's noises going on, it makes it more difficult for them, right? So then what we're seeing is that extroversion or introversion, according to Eysenck, is really only an outward expression of your natural inherited cortical arousal level. So then you really don't have much control over your personality, although he will, and we're going to talk about this more when we talk about psychoticism in a second, he will say that there is plenty of room for external factors to impact your personality, but especially extroversion and neuroticism, according to Eysenck, they're very biological in nature, okay? So then the idea is that an extroverted person is an individual who has a low arousal level naturally, so they want to go out and seek excitement to raise that level. On the other hand, an introverted person is one who naturally has a very high arousal level, so they don't want additional arousal. They try to avoid that whenever possible. Okay? So, and of course, if you have questions about this, shoot me an email. So Eysenck then suggested that the second trait or super factor that he suggested was neuroticism. Now we did talk about neuroticism last time we were talking about the big five. So neuroticism here, if extroversion is contrasted with introversion, then neuroticism is going to be contrasted with emotional stability. The idea that someone who is high on neuroticism is someone who is likely to be low on emotional stability. In other words, they're kind of opposite ends of the pole there. So someone who is high on neuroticism is someone who may be a very anxious, worrisome kind of person, someone who's depressed, someone who feels guilty a lot, maybe someone who has low self-esteem, someone who may be kind of moody, kind of unpredictable a little bit in that way, maybe shy, that kind of thing. So what we're seeing here is that people who are high on neuroticism, because they do tend to have a hard time stabilizing their emotions, they are probably at an increased risk for several different psychological disorders. Last week during the activity, I asked you guys to think about some ways that personality could be related to psychological illness. And actually, this week's lecture, as you'll see, is going to ask you to consider how personality is related to like actual physical health. But we'll get there in a second. So then how does Eysenck explain where your level of neuroticism comes from? If your level of extroversion is related to your arousal level of your brain, like naturally, then where does neuroticism come from? Well, to be able to explain this, I have to give you a basic description of the nervous system here. So many of you may already know this information, but The basic idea here is that you have several different branches of your nervous system. We won't go into great detail about most of them, but the ones we do need to talk about are the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic nervous system. They're both types of your peripheral nervous system, which means that we're talking about involuntary things for the most part. We're talking about things that control, like, for example, blood flow, heart rate, that kind of thing that you can't necessarily voluntarily control. But so you have your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system. Now, your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight system. In other words, when your sympathetic nervous system is kicked in, it means that your heart starts racing, your blood pressure goes up, you start hyperventilating, you probably start sweating, your muscles become very tense. So you can think about situations in which your sympathetic nervous system kicks in. Maybe if you have test anxiety, or any kind of anxiety, but usually when you have a test, you're a little bit nervous about that, and so maybe you feel that sympathetic nervous system kick in. Maybe you were almost in a car accident. Maybe you almost hit another car, and your heart rate gets up, and that kicks in there. Whatever the case may be, something that causes you anxiety activates your sympathetic nervous system. Your body is preparing itself to fight or run away. On the other hand, you have your parasympathetic nervous system, that part of your body that then calms your body down. So the parasympathetic nervous system is going to slow your heart rate. It's going to decrease your blood pressure. It's going to help your body relax. It's sometimes called resting and digesting. So if you're in a life or death situation, your body says, okay, digestion is clearly not a priority right now. We need to get blood flow to those muscles so that we can fight or run away. When the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, digestion is a priority, so think about laying on the couch watching football on Thanksgiving when you've just eaten a big meal. Like that feeling, that's your parasympathetic nervous system. Now, I describe this because it's important for any individual to have a balance between the two. There are certain times in life when you need your fight or flight. You need your sympathetic nervous system to kick in and force you to pay attention, to force you to take that test, to force you so that you move over so that you don't hit the other car, whatever. But we can also see that someone whose parasympathetic nervous system never kicks in, who's always experiencing the sympathetic fight or flight mode, is someone who's going to be anxious all the time. So this is where neuroticism comes into play. So Eysenck would suggest that individuals who are high in neuroticism, so the ones who are anxious, the ones who are tense, he would say that these are individuals who have an overactive sympathetic nervous system. Their sympathetic nervous system does not take breaks the way it should. It's overly responsive. This means that an individual who's high in neuroticism is likely to overreact to little things. But that might not be a personality trait so much. Well, it is a personality trait, but it's created by biology. An individual who has a very reactive sympathetic nervous system is someone who is always going to be in fight or flight mode. Okay? On the other hand, someone who is low on neuroticism, so someone more on the emotionally stable side, is someone who has a good balance, or maybe their sympathetic nervous system is a little bit more calm. It doesn't kick in as much. So these are individuals who are less likely to panic. So once again, this could be biological in nature, and Eysenck suggested that extroversion and neuroticism in particular were biological. Okay. And then the last one here is psychoticism. So you might have heard the word psychotic. The term psychotic can kind of get kicked around a lot, and many times when we think about the term psychotic, we think about something like schizophrenia. Psychotic is basically the idea that someone has lost touch with reality. So when we're talking about psychoticism here, someone who scores high on this particular trait is likely to be a very aggressive person. Probably not the kind of person who feels remorse when they hurt other people. Someone who considers themselves to be very tough, right? Kind of impersonal, kind of cold. Maybe they don't think much about other people. They tend to focus more on themselves, kind of egocentric individual here. So then someone who's high on psychoticism is someone who's likely to basically be angry and aggressive and not to have very much impulse control, which means they might lash out and hurt other people. So then on the opposite end, someone who is low in psychoticism is someone who is likely to be very much in control of their impulses. This doesn't mean that the person doesn't get angry. Doesn't mean that they don't at times get upset, but they're able to control that, to handle that so that they don't lash out, so that they don't hurt other people. They're more likely to think about other people instead of only focusing on themselves. So then, Psychoticism, according to Eysenck, is probably also strongly biological, but not quite as biological as the other two. So we can see that some individuals are more aggressive than others, and aggression being very important for Eysenck's theory of psychoticism. And we do see that individuals who have this trait are more likely to be male. So males are more likely than females to be in this category of psychoticism, to be high on psychoticism. So then maybe it has to do with testosterone, with hormone levels, something like that. But also more so than with the other two, Eysenck suggested that psychoticism is environmental as well. It's especially found with authoritarian parenting. So authoritarian parenting is parenting that is very high on discipline and structure, but very low on affection. So the kinds of parents that are basically dictators who set up rules and dole out punishments, but that are not particularly warm and loving and caring toward their children, they're much more likely to end up having this personality type being high on psychoticism here as well. And when we think about someone who's antisocial, someone who doesn't think about other people, we probably think about criminals here. So we would expect to see someone higher in a level of psychoticism if they've exhibited that dangerous criminal behavior as well. And so then we have to think about, with all three of these factors, there are certain situations in which these individuals will thrive, potentially. Can we see that there are some situations where extroverted individuals will thrive? Situations where they're required to be around other people and work with other people, versus individuals who are introverted would thrive in a different kind of situation. Neuroticism sounds like a bad thing, someone who's always depressed, someone who's always anxious, but neuroticism is not always a bad thing. We often see that neurotic individuals, or individuals who are high on neuroticism, tend to be more of a perfectionist, which can be a bad thing for sure, but it also means that they tend to double check their work, keep working at something until it's the way that they want it to be, so having high standards. So there are situations in which these individuals can thrive. There are also situations in which an individual high in psychoticism can thrive here. I mean, think about this. An individual who is naturally aggressive and tough, that individual could turn to a life of crime, but could we also see how that individual might thrive in certain situations? Maybe someone who is aggressive and tough might end up being a good athlete, maybe in particular like a football player, for example. It involves tackling, right? Actually, like contact sports there, or potentially something related to military, something like that. There are other positions in which someone who is high in psychoticism could thrive. But once again, Eysenck would suggest that most of this is going to be inherited from your parents. Okay? Although some will be related to your environment. Basically, touching on that point here, Eysenck suggested that as much as 3/4 of our personality is basically accounted for by heredity, which means that you are born with 75% of your personality already in place, according to Eysenck. So then we know that the other 1/4, the other 25%, is accounted for by your environment, the kind of parenting you received, where you grew up, that kind of thing. Now, follow with me here. If these traits are describing someone's personality, and these traits come primarily from biology, then it would make sense to find these traits everywhere in the world. If it's not really a nurture-specific, culture-specific trait, but traits based on biology, based on arousal levels, based on sympathetic nervous system, wouldn't we find these traits everywhere? And it turns out that we do. There's been a lot of research replicating these findings across different cultures, so that supports Eysenck's theory. Also, once again, if you were born with these predispositions in place, it would make sense that these traits would be stable over time. So if you're born with a predisposition towards kind of that high sympathetic nervous system arousal, you'll probably continue to have that throughout your lifetime. So if it impacts your behavior at one point and your personality at one point, it probably will continue to. Carrying on with this idea of biology, twin research, which is used frequently to try to take apart this nature-nurture issue, suggests that there are strong similarities in twins, especially in identical twins. So keeping in mind that identical twins are basically genetically identical, whereas fraternal twins are no more alike than any other sibling pair genetically. It's just that they're in the womb at the same time, born the same, usually the same day, same age. So what we see is that identical twins tend to be more alike in personality, tend to be more alike in biology and genetics as well. It seems like a lot of what Eysenck had to say makes sense. All right, so then it leads us to have this question of what do we do with this information and how can we predict behavior based on these personality traits? Well, we have seen throughout the research that we're going to be talking about here that there is some consistency with people's behaviors and their personality. So one thing that we see, academic performance is closely related to personality. I mentioned this a second ago, but someone who is neurotic is someone who's probably going to double check, triple check their work, and so that actually can improve academic outcomes at times. Creativity is related here, antisocial aggressive behavior is related here, all of these things, as well as disease-causing behaviors. Now, we certainly understand that there are some diseases that are not caused by personal behavior, but there are some diseases in which there are behaviors that you could have done to help prevent that, healthy diet, healthy exercise, low stress life, if that's even theoretically possible, getting as much sleep, that kind of thing. So then we're interested in the connection between personality and disease. So if we know that some of your health is caused by your behavior, and we know that some of your behavior is caused by your personality, then what is the link between personality and health? Well, as it's saying here, we've found an association. The reason why this says association, when you hear the word association, we're talking about a correlation. These are correlational research findings because we can't determine causation. We cannot randomly assign someone to have a certain kind of personality. We cannot randomly assign someone to have a certain disease. So it's going to have to be correlational research. And what we know about correlational research is that it cannot prove causation. Okay, we don't know the cause for sure, but we know there's a relationship here. So a couple of things that we found that it depends on the particular disease. So individuals who have been diagnosed with cancer, if they are the individuals that are more likely to say they feel helpless, they feel hopeless, as you could see that someone who's high on neuroticism might be a little bit, someone who's having a hard time reining in those emotions and they're feeling helpless and hopeless, those individuals were less likely to survive the disease. On the other hand, those individuals then who said, I'm not going to let this beat me, I'm going to fight back, that survivor mentality, were more likely to survive. Once again, that's not causational. We can't prove that it's the personality trait that causes that, but we do see an association. But that's not always the case. What we see is it's different for different diseases. Individuals who have diseases or health issues that are specifically related to the cardiovascular system, so we're talking about heart disease or that kind of thing, those individuals who tend to be a little bit higher on neuroticism there, or maybe higher in psychoticism, whatever the case may be, individuals who have high levels of arousal, so that neuroticism idea of having your sympathetic nervous system being aroused all the time, or that are high on anger, aggression, they are more likely to die when diagnosed with a heart condition, whereas individuals who've been diagnosed with a heart condition who are more calm were more likely to survive that. So once again, this is not proving anything for sure. We can't do that kind of research, but there's a relationship here. All right, lots to talk about today. So what I wanted to try to show you on this slide is that there have been several different research studies that have examined the relationship between these personality factors and biological inherited factors. But I'm not going to ask you on the test to tell me what each one of these research studies says. I am going to kind of go through and generally talk about some of these research findings. I've already touched on them a little bit. So I'm not necessarily wanting you to know which person said what, but I am wanting you to know some about these research findings. So, like for example, we already talked a little bit earlier about the difference between an extroverted and an introverted person. We said that an extroverted person is someone who probably has a naturally low level of cortical arousal, so then they go seeking after excitement, that kind of thing. So we said that those individuals are probably going to perform best when they have a high level of stimulation, so when they have people there with them, maybe when they have music playing in the background, that kind of thing, okay? On the other hand, when we have introverted individuals, they tend to already have naturally high cortical arousal levels. So that means that they tend to avoid excitement whenever possible, So they're going to have their best performance when there's a low level of stimulation. So this is the research study we're talking about here. They tend to do better when they have low levels of stimulation, so they need quiet, maybe they need to be alone. So typically I hear this when I talk to college students. Some of them will say, I have to have music on when I study, I have to have the TV on when I'm studying. Other students say, I can't have any kind of noise whatsoever, or it's a distraction for me. Perhaps there's a personality component to that as well, right? So we've been talking about a lot of these different research findings. We're seeing that there is a strong connection between your genetics and your personality, and a strong connection between your personality and your behavior. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that there's not a role for your environment to play here. But one of the other things that we found here was that extroverted individuals, so those individuals that tend to be more sociable and more outgoing, they tend to move more quickly, like physically move more quickly. They walk more quickly, they move more quickly than introverted people. But what we have found is that introverted individuals tend to think a little bit more quickly than extroverted individuals. Once again, we're asking the question, is this nature, is this nurture? We think there's a strong genetic component there. There's been a lot of research to support this theory that really what we see as personality is really just an expression of our biology, these characteristics that we know are very much related here. All right, so your activity for this week is to tell me your thoughts on the relationship between psychological health and physical health. So what I'm thinking here is, how can your psychological health improve your physical health? How could your psychological health hurt your physical health? And you could also think about this the other way. How could your physical health help or hurt your psychological health? So thinking about individuals maybe who have a psychological condition, someone who's depressed, for example, someone who's anxious, how do you think that could impact their physical health? On the other hand, someone who has good psychological health, who's not struggling with any of these issues, how could that impact their physical health as well? And then you could think about someone maybe who's received a diagnosis of a disease or a disorder physically, how that could then impact their psychological health. Eysenck really had a lot to say about this relationship between biology and personality, and to me it seems very logical. It seems to make a lot of sense. So this week I want you guys to think about the connection between psychological and physical health, which I think is important to talk about, because I think we have a stigma often about getting help for psychological issues. It's like it's okay to seek out help for what we would consider a medical problem, a physical problem. We go to the eye doctor, we go to the dentist, but we don't go see a psychologist because there's a stigma against that, and there shouldn't be. I think that your psychological health and your mental health, well, yes, that. Psychological health and physical health is what I mean to say. Really two sides of the same coin, both very important. Excellent. So you're going to have to give me your dental fillings and your glasses and your Tylenol before you can have my Zoloft. Thank you for that. All right, moving on, back to lecture here. We're talking about the critique of trait and factor theories. This is going to be pretty much the same as we talked about last week when we talked about McCrae and Costa. They're going to be very high on generating research, as you've seen throughout this lecture. Lots of research cited. They're high on parsimony, so they're relatively straightforward, fairly simple. High on organizing knowledge, moderate on falsifiability. It's sometimes difficult to falsify whether someone has a trait such as psychoticism, that kind of thing. Moderate to low is a guide for practitioners. You might not know exactly how to use the information from lecture today. If we find that someone is high on psychoticism or high on neuroticism, are we supposed to change that, and how do we go about changing that? So we may not have quite as much of a guide for practitioners here. And internal consistency, a lot of these traits overlap each other to a certain point, and so that can make it difficult to tease them apart. Also similar to what we talked about last week, when we're talking about trait theory, it doesn't have much to say about determinism versus free choice or optimism versus pessimism. It just is what it is. But Eysenck did seem to emphasize biology, conscious influences, and uniqueness. All right, so that is the end of lecture for today. So remember that you do have exam 3. It's going to be released on Monday, April 3rd at noon, so 12 p.m., and it'll be available until noon or 12 p.m. on the next Monday. I will also be posting a review video for you guys. Don't forget you do have an activity this week, so just let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys during the review video.